Thank you, and thank you all for being here today. Senator Wirth, you've spent much of your life in public service serving your country, and I want to thank you for that, including as a member of this body. You were on the landmark panel in 1988, which included Dr. Hansen and Dr. Oppenheimer, where the alarms were first sounded on climate change. Do you happen to remember if there was much talk about the next generation on that panel and about protecting our kids and doing something for our kids?
Well, there were two scientists on the panel, Oppenheimer and Hansen, and I was just the convener. I was the political hack putting it all together. But the discussion afterwards was truly intense. I think people were very surprised to hear somebody say this is not something that's theoretical, but it reached over from the theoretical into the practical. This is something that we observed. And the impact that then began to engage for people was significant. And was there a focus on young people? Yes, because we began to understand this was going to be an intergenerational battle. And we're not going to be able to solve it in one generation, but we're leaving for the next generation an enormous legacy of damage that's been done to the environment and the living community. Well, so it's our obligation to really move on it much more aggressively than we might have otherwise.
The reason I ask is because I was born in 1987. So when you had that panel in June of 1988, I was in diapers and I was 9 months old. I hadn't walked yet. So now
welcomed you.
So now I'm the generation that's here, and I have kids literally coming into my office almost every day who are 7, 8 years old. Their parents are telling me that they have nightmares, they can't sleep because they're worried about climate change and they're worried about whether there's going to be a planet. So you know, I feel obligated to be the voice of the next generation who's standing here saying nothing was done or not enough was done. And I know that's not on you per se, but I do think that this is a mandate that we have to act now. And I come from a district that's very split between Democrats and Republicans. And one thing that I've learned recently is that Democrats and Republicans didn't seem to be so far apart as they were previously. Can you tell us if Democrats and Republicans on the committee shared a belief in the science on climate change?
Well, at that point, as I pointed out earlier, we introduced a major climate bill, the first big one right after the Hansen hearing, and 16 titles that ranged all across everything we've talked about today and more. And at the time of introduction, there were 20 members of the Senate who sponsored the bill on its introduction, and those were 12 Democrats and 8 Republicans. I mean, we were following in the footsteps of Dole and Mitchell, who had a very tight partnership in thinking about what had to be done in the world of clean air, and the Clean Air Act amendments were just coming up. There were any number of partnerships between members of both parties. So there was a real feeling of cooperative endeavor. Now, how that got broken up is something that's worthwhile you all thinking about and coming to understand, because I think there's a very important lesson in that. And from that, we might get a better sense of how we bring people back together again. To understand our history is always a helpful thing to do, I think.
Absolutely. Thank you. And Dr. Oppenheimer, would you agree?
On bipartisan?
Yeah, with this impression.
Of course. Many of the political leaders I dealt with over the years were Republicans and were exerting strong leadership on this issue, going back to Rhode Island Senator Chafee. And we'd love to see those days return.
So, Senator, you attended the Earth Summit in Rio in 1992, where over 100 heads of state assembled to address global warming for the first time in history. In the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, the treaty that came out of that summit, the parties, including the United States, bound themselves to, quote, stabilize greenhouse gas concentrations at a level that would prevent dangerous anthropogenic, human-induced interference with the climate system. That treaty was supported by President George H.W. Bush and ratified unanimously by the Senate in 1992. Senator Wirth, how did we get from that place to, with unanimous ratification to the Senate's rejection of the Kyoto Protocol just 5 years later? It seems like a very quick turnaround.
Well, I think at that point, things were moving very rapidly, both among the advocates and the opponents of doing anything in terms of climate change. I think that the people who were very concerned about the Clean Air Act amendments, about the Kyoto, about the ozone treaty that came out of Montreal. There were a number of major national and international actions at that point that I think caught many in the industry by surprise. They happened so quickly, and out of that, I think they decided to mobilize, and out of that came their very effective, from my perspective, unfortunately, the Global Climate Coalition, and that lasted for about 20 years, engaging almost every major industry in the country until they dropped off slowly but surely, and the Global Climate Coalition faded out in the early part of the 20th century.
I know I'm out of time, but I just want to sum up quickly and tell me if I'm right or wrong. But it sounds like the fossil fuel industry got scared of rapid changes happening and kind of mobilized and left the next generation, my generation, in the dust and left us with a lack of action entirely.
And the advocates on the other side were caught by surprise themselves at the vitriolic and incredibly well-organized and highly funded efforts on the other side. So suddenly both sides, who had been spending an enormous amount of time and energy together for the last 25 years, were split asunder by this rapidly changing political environment.
Well, I would argue that we now have to make sure that the time is now to not be caught by surprise. We've had 30 years to try and figure out action moving forward, and I thank you for your testimony, and we'll carry the torch.